Many voters are concerned that the democratic process could be at risk.
Democracy is in decline across large parts of the world's surface.
How worried should we be about democracy? That's a question at the root of much of our discussion on this podcast. So we thought it was time to tackle it head on.
There's been an ongoing campaign against independent civil society organizations in Hungary.
Those in power seek to undermine every institution or norm that gives democracy meaning.
Well-functioning democracies are about more than just elections or referenda. We need a free press and the rule of law, human rights, people's involvement in politics beyond voting every few years.
This is what democracy looks like.
But what we see now is, on the one hand, amongst the public, the kind of rise of polarisation, pessimism, disillusionment. On the other, we see populism, which has been caricatured as a kind of illiberal democracy. People who get elected but don't have a great deal of respect for all the other things that we might associate with a fully democratic society.
Unless we find a way to recover a reason for democracy, there is no fight for democracy to be had.
You're listening to Polarised, the podcast from the RSA that's all about trying to understand the big divides in our society and our culture and the forces driving us further apart. It's presented by Matthew Taylor and by me, Ian Leslie. Coming up, we'll be talking to Niheer Dasandi and Eliane Glaser about how doomed or not doomed we might be. But before we get started, this is a segment where Matthew and I lay our cards on the table and set out what we know or think we know about this episode's topic. We call it full disclosure. Matthew, what's your starting point?
The thing I've been thinking about, Ian, is whether we can get a conversation going which connects two things. On the one hand, kind of philosophical or psychoanalytic descriptions of how hard it is to live our lives, that it's just not easy to make your life meaningful in the modern world in particular. And on the other hand, all the conversations that you and I have about kind of what's going wrong with the system, the democratic system. We had Will Davis on last time, and I think he was starting to approach some of these questions about the challenges of making our lives meaningful. He was talking about how the difference between war and peace has broken down, the difference between reason and emotion has broken down. Francis Fukuyama's most recent book, Identity, also explores the challenge of how it is that we can pursue and have a sense of identity in the modern world. So I wrote a blog recently asking whether politics could ever be about instilling in us wisdom rather than just increasing our anxiety. And I guess this is related to two things. One is the sense that at heart populism is about the denial of complexity. And so somehow politicians have to talk about complexity. And if you talk about complexity, part of the complexity is the complexity of how we live our lives. And on the other hand, that kind of sense that we've always assumed in the past that the politicians who are successful are the ones who give us hope. You know, like Obama, like Clinton, like Blair. Maybe we need politicians who don't give us hope, but they have a capacity to engage us with realism. They have a capacity to engage us with the fact that we have to make difficult trade-offs, that life is there. I'm interested that Ben Rhodes' book about, he was Barack Obama's speechwriter, foreign affairs speechwriter. The book starts full of hope and idealism. And at the end, he says that Obama starts to become very interested in books like Johanna Ari's book about how difficult it is actually for human beings to make any difference to anything. It's almost as if he has to comfort himself at the end by saying, actually, we don't have that much agency. So it was a kind of speculation about whether or not we could ever have a politics which was about wisdom rather than about politics that in the end offered us things which are impossible. Just a final point. I also wanted to say in that blog that in the end, all the populists are doing what the mainstream politicians did, but they're doing it on steroids. Because the mainstream politicians also used to say, elect me and everything will be fine. And the only reason everything is difficult in your life is because of these bastards who are running the country. So I feel that whatever happens with populism, we've got to somehow have a politics that isn't about saying vote for me and everything's going to be fine.
Okay. That's very deep. I'm going to give you a very sort of superficial alternative answer to the question of what democracy is for and so on. I think for most people is two very basic things. One is we want stuff to run. We don't want there to be a lot of crime. We want to be able to get around our daily life with some facility and without fear, without being threatened. And the second thing is we want to be able to chuck the bastards out, right? If they're not doing that properly. Other than that, I actually don't think people want or need wisdom from politicians. I don't think most people look to politics for meaning in their life. I know some people do, but most people don't. They're basically outsourcing the running of of society in order that they can focus on creating meaning in their own lives, in their family and friends.
So we've got two great guests, so we'll have to move on in a second. But the reason I disagree with that is because I think that that in our needs and expectations in human beings is something which is unfulfillable. So it seems to me that unless democracy has a way of explaining to us that things like our identity demands, our desire on the one hand to have an identity which says we're the same as everybody else, we have the same rights as everybody else, but on the other hand, actually my group or my country is in some way superior. Unless we have a way of dealing with that, it becomes unmanageable, and that's part of where we are today. So I think whether we like it or not, democracy has to find a way of helping us to understand that we can't have everything we want, or else we end up with people who are very good at promising us everything we want, and that's partly where we are now. Anyway, let's return to that next time.
Yeah, indeed.
Tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
With those questions in mind, we're joined by two guests who can hopefully help us feel a little less gloomy about the state of democracy and optimistic about where we're going. Niheer Dasandi is a political scientist at the University of Birmingham and author of a new book called Is Democracy Failing? Hello, Niheer.
Hello.
And we're also joined by Eliane Glaser, writer and lecturer, and author of Anti-Politics, on the demonization of ideology, authority, and the state. Hello, Eliane.
Hello.
Niheer, I'm going to start with you. Let's start with the definition of democracy, right? What is democracy? And if we're looking at whether or not it's failing, what should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously a contested issue in terms of how we define democracy. But I would say it involves four basic components, which Matthew's already touched on. So the first is competition for power. So governments are chosen and replaced through free and fair elections. The second would be citizen participation in civic and political life. So that means voting, but it also means more than that, being informed and engaged with politics, being able to campaign, being able to set up organisations that meet their interests and their needs in society. The third would be the kind of basic protection of people's fundamental rights. So human rights and individual rights are protected within that society. And the fourth would be the rule of law. So leaders, governments rule according to law. They don't make arbitrary decisions. And people are equal before the law and treated equally in front of the law.
Okay, so when we're talking about democracy being under threat, what are we talking about? Do people mean different things by that? So some people say, liberal democracy is under threat, but democracy itself is safe, or there are different forms of democracy we should be pursuing. What can you just kind of help us frame that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because the argument that democracy is under threat, if we were to take just elections, currently we have more elected leaders than we've ever seen in history. So if we were to take just one part, there's nothing to suggest that democracy is failing. But if we're then to look at some of the other parts of democracy, so issues such as the rule of law, issues such as individual rights and civil society, I think that's where we start to see some of the problems. So the argument I would make is that what we're seeing is one part of democracy, which is popular support, so leaders that have come to power through winning elections, being used to undermine other parts of the democratic system. So individual rights, civil society participation, and even in some cases the rule of law. So I think that's a tension. And some would say, that's not a failure of democracy. That's a failure of liberal democracy, as you've pointed out, that, we're conflating two things. It's a very fine line. So the issue is, once you start to lose those other parts of a democratic system, gradually even the elections won't make sense. So if people are restricted from accessing information because there are severe kind of restrictions on the media, at what point do elections stop being free and fair once those things happen? I
mean, I'm already put in mind of this of a distinction that Yascha Mounk made in his recent book, which is between what he calls illiberal democracy, which is, I think, here what you're describing. So you have elections, but you don't have the other kind of aspects of this. But of course, Yascha Mounk says that is a response in part to what he describes as undemocratic liberalism, which might take us to some of Eliane's critiques, I guess, of democracy, which is that the previous democracy, the Blair-Clinton model of democracy, was one in which decisions were made by elites. And it wasn't really terribly democratic because whoever was in power, you more or less kind of got the same kind of stuff. I'm interested in that, but I think one of the questions I just want to ask you one more question about rights. So there's a big debate about rights in political philosophy, negative rights and positive rights. Now, your notion of rights, it seems to me, is primarily that negative right. So the right not to be interfered with unreasonably by the state or by other people. Many people would say, yeah, but this is a society where if you look at positive rights, your right to fully participate, well, we've been denying those people rights for a very long time. Young people don't have the right to own their own house, or people don't have the right to have a decent job, or it depends on your account of rights whether or not you think liberal democracy was ever delivering it, doesn't it?
No, I think that's exactly right. And while when I speak about human rights and individual rights, you're right, I am focusing on those negative rights. That's not to say that the positive rights issues such as economic security, access to housing, those things aren't important. And I think that's exactly right, that those are the sorts of things that people have in the past. We haven't done enough within democratic societies to address some of those issues. So I'd completely agree that's where the backlash is in part at least coming from. By focusing on negative rights, that's not to undermine the importance of positive rights, such as economic rights, such as access to health. I think is a really important issue.
Yeah. So I guess it goes to the public's attitude. I mean, you said to the public, would you prefer a society where your kids can all afford a home and where you've got economic security, but occasionally people get banged up in prison without proper due process? I mean, I don't know where people would lie on that issue.
Just one more kind of framing question here, because we inevitably we'll kind of focus on the UK and the US and Trump and Brexit, and we're thinking about this. But what's the kind of global situation? Just looking at it in terms of the big picture as well. So over the last sort of 50 years and then over the last sort of 5-10 years, what's been the health of democracy? Is democracy spreading? Is it shrinking? Is it in retreat?
We're seeing different types of trends according to what aspects of democracy we look at. So I think the reason why people are suddenly very concerned about democracy currently is that we're seeing in countries where we thought, democracy is done, so Western Europe, in the US, we're seeing democracy come under threat. If you look globally in countries which previously haven't had elected leaders, we're seeing more elected leaders. While that has now been accepted as an important part of democracy globally, what we're seeing is this issue of rights being trodden on. The reasoning being that because these leaders have come to power through elections, therefore what they do is democratic.
So you can have the elections, but unless you have the institutions and the norms of a democracy, it's hard to sustain that. But there is a scrap of optimism there. I'm gonna cling to it. Eliane, is there something about the way that we've done politics, especially in this country, over the past 10 or 20 years, that you think has led us to this point?
For me, one of the essential characteristics of democracy is agonism, is the existence of clearly defined ideological options to choose between. And we've seen, returning to Fukuyama, his famous 1989 essay, The End of History, which heralded the end of the ideological opposition between East and West, left and right. And I think that essay was very prescient. I think that we did seem to supposedly enter a sort of post-ideological period where politicians didn't set out clearly defined positions for the people to choose from. Instead, they put the onus onto listening to voters. Obviously, the rise of technocracy is part of that supposedly post-ideological landscape. Of course, ideological distinctions and oppositions didn't go away. And actually what we've had, I think, in the last few decades is the dominance of neoliberalism, but it's a disavowed neoliberalism. It's the right presented as common sense. There is no alternative. It's the only possible position is to be right-wing because it makes economic sense. So
Eliane, just to interrupt you, I so want to clarify what you're saying. Are you saying that the problem, in a sense, was that there was no ideological alternative to neoliberalism? But are you saying also that, in a sense, even if we had a political system, an economic system that you thought was more benign, you still think that politics has to be about ideology, because if politics isn't about ideology, it undermines that, in a sense, there's no point of democracy. So even in the kind of perfect society, would you want to be seeing an ideological battle taking place?
I would, yes. So thinking about polarisation, to me there are good polarisations and bad ones. And I think a good one is democratic opposition. I want tribal divisions. I want polarisation in that sense. That's a productive opposition. But
so you must be very happy with the world at the moment, then.
No, because what we have now is polarisation on the grounds not of democratic alternatives or ideological alternatives. We have polarisation on the grounds of identity. So the divisions now are not between left and right. They're between somewheres and anywheres, people who believe in gay marriage, people who don't.
It used to be that Labour had a 3-1 lead on the basis of class. There's now no distinction on the basis of class. It's entirely on the basis of age. They have a 3-1 lead amongst young people. So we've gone from class to age as being the determined. And education also very important.
Yeah, so you have, and those divisions are really dangerous because they're unbridgeable divisions. If you can have a healthy debate about politics, that's fine, because that's what unites a democratic society, is having those productive debates. But I think the left has been buried. I think the left has become toxic, but the right has become sort of embarrassed and coy as well. So it used to be that the right would declare itself openly. We believe in a measure of inequality creates dynamism in a society. Now the right say they're on the side of the working people. They've embraced lots of liberal values around gay marriage and so on. So actually it's the right also that's sort of burying or being coy about its ideology. And I think that lack of ideological explicitness has led to populism, because populism appears to be, it's a sort of a stand-in for ideological expression. If Trump makes outrageous statements, it's a sort of proxy for ideological explicitness.
So, Eliane, one of the great things of getting old is I've actually lived through the cycles now. So I get this kind of wisdom of having been there when things were different. I remember the mid-'80s, early 80s in the UK, we had the most left-wing major party in Europe and the most right-wing major party simultaneously. So we had in the 1983 election, we had Margaret Thatcher in her kind of full pomp, and we had Michael Foot with the Labour Party manifesto. What went wrong then? Because this sounds like heaven for you. I mean, we had an absolutely unashamed kind of right-wing combination of neoliberal economics and a kind of patriotic kind of social conservatism. And as I say, we had fully fledged socialism in one country. Why did that not sustain, if that's the healthy way of things being?
Well, I do hark back to that time. At least, we had ideological explicitness. The trouble was that the right was dominant for me. But that you can blame the tabloid press.
Yeah. But you are saying that is your kind of ideal. But that state of politics is preferable to the one we had subsequently.
Yes, because what we have now is the advent of populism, which is essentially anti-ideological. It's an us and them politics, and that relates to the anti-immigration sentiment. But actually what we have now is a populism that's against the political system per se, so that system that we had. I mean, in a way, it's a paradoxical phenomenon, populism, because it's the desire for the levers of representative democracy to be once again functional, but at the same time it's an anti-political force because it's against the political system that we have. And that's my problem with populism, is that it's an anti-system.
Niheer, what's your kind of view of the relationship between ideology and healthy democracy? A kind of Goldilocks view, which is you need a certain amount of disagreement, but not too much. If you've got a consensus,
can I ask a slightly, very similar, slightly different question, which is what's the role of emotion or kind of shared sentiment and identity? Because we can talk about democracy as a set of institutions and norms and rights and so on, but it seems to be it only really works if people feel like they're on the same team.
I mean, part of what we're seeing now is that loss of a democratic culture. So it sort of gets to this feeling of we belong to this system, we have a say in that system, and
this country.
Yeah, to this country, and we see the political system as part of this country, and that's we belong to both of those things, and those two things aren't separated out. I'd be wary of kind of saying, I think, harking back to kind of a more clear distinction between where political parties stand is what's going to get citizens reconnected into politics.
So we have to then, you're both academics, so this is, or in part at least academics, so this is the question you hate. What are you going to do about it? I know it's not your job, your job is to tell us what's gone wrong. But Niheer, starting with you, if you were kind of world emperor, or you could get all the party leaders into a room or whatever, what would be the things you'd want concretely to do? And I'm a great advocate of the greater use of deliberative democracy, for example. So I've got my own little idea, my own little widget that I would use to try to create things. Where would you start?
So one of the things that's really important right now is starting with a conceptualization of democracy that includes more than just elections. And I think there's a sense in which the rhetoric, at least, is losing sight of that. For me, and I think the deliberation point is interesting, because for me, the point of democracy is that there isn't going to be that. So, there isn't going to be that obvious answer to how we get things back.
Eliane?
I would seek to question what it is about representative democracy that we value. What's legitimate about the authority of politicians? So we don't all kind of end up with this endless deferring to the people. What's actually legitimate about political representation, the structures and systems and institutions of representative democracy? What do we value about those institutions per se, and in what ways have they been corrupted by the revolving door to business and financialization, technocracy and so on, so that we can start to try and reinvent those terms: representative democracy, political authority, ideology, and actually we may need to reinvent the words that we use to articulate those values, because they have become toxic.
It's interesting because the question about representative democracy is, it's absolutely fascinating and fundamental. And actually, you see, I agree, it's really being demonized in some sense, or at least it's under threat. You see it in America as well. The absolute kind of fierce party loyalty and polarization has come back from the fact that nobody really believes or wants their representatives to kind of think for themselves anymore. They just want them to line up on one side or the other and do the bidding of the president or the party.
So I think I think what's really interesting to me, and we unfortunately we have to finish because with this conversation going, because I think what's fascinating is in some senses it seems to me, Niheer and Eliane, that you disagree quite profoundly, actually, that you're kind of speaking of the need for kind of consensus and a recognition of the importance of the kind of system as a whole. And Eliane, you're kind of saying actually in many ways we need a more explicit ideological kind of conversation, and we need to understand the deep problems with the system as it was. But actually the thing you have in common, which I think is interesting, is you want people to attend to the nature of the system, to think more deeply about what's going on when people represent us. What do we mean by democracy? What do rights actually mean? So I think that's a very interesting kind of
And I don't think
question.
we've given it nearly as much thought as it deserves. And just generally as a country, and you see this in the US as well, we haven't really thought hard about these questions. We sort of assume this is the way the world is. And now we're realizing, no, the world doesn't have to be this way. Yep. So what are we losing?
So thank you both. It's been a really great conversation. And it is only polite to remind our listeners of the books that you've written. So Eliane, your book is Anti-Politics on the Demonization of Ideology, Authority and the State, available on all good neoliberal websites now. And Niheer, your book is Democracy Failing. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating. But before we go, actually I shouldn't say but, because it sounds like the next bit's not going to be fascinating. But before we go, we end each episode with a provocation, something that shifted the way that we look at the world just a little bit. And I think, Ian, moving from the kind of sublime to the ridiculous, you want to talk about refrigerators.
Yeah. I wrote a piece for the New Statesman about fake news, although it's actually about the kind of the way we do democracy in general. But it started because I came across this theory of the reason that people consume fake news, which is slightly different from the dominant theory. So a dominant explanation is that people love fake news because when it confirms their bias, so they see something that agrees with them, they'll go, yeah, click, share. There's an alternative explanation, which is that the reason fake news thrives is that people can't be bothered to think very hard. So if they see something interesting or kind of provocative, they will click or share it. So one of the papers that these guys wrote about it is called "Why We're Lazy, Not Biased," and they have this kind of grand theory of history, which I thought was really interesting, which is the term is cognitive control, right? So if you have more cognitive control, they find in their experiments, you're less likely to believe in fake news. You're also less likely to believe in kind of fake profundities by Deepak Chopra. I mean, literally, they tested these kind of like meaningless but pseudo wise sayings, and the same people who fell for those are the same people who sort of enjoyed clicking on fake news.
Aren't they just stupid?
So no, they are. Well, they're stupid in the sense that we are all stupid from time to time, which is we do things without thinking.
Right.
And the problem with the internet is that it encourages us to live by our impulses and our feelings. It's something we talked about with Will Davis the other week. And so cognitive control is basically analytical reasoning and thinking hard about what you're doing, but it's effortful and it's hard work. So that's all interesting. But then the kind of really the kicker to this is that they have this kind of grand theory of history, which is that society goes through these big cycles of cognitive control followed by complete lack of cognitive control, because the cognitive control allows us to build technologies, which then allows us to abandon our critical faculties, right? So in a really kind of tough society where you have to plan your food consumption because you don't have very, very much food around, then you have to have a lot of cognitive control, right? Because you have to kind of plan your food consumption, plan how you're going to eat. In a society of abundance, say, where you've invented the fridge through the application of cognitive control, it's a very kind of complex technology. So we've solved that problem for you. Here's the fridge, right? So I'm looking at the kind of span of the last sort of 100, 200 years. Then that leads to a lack of cognitive control. People say, oh, well, I can eat whenever I want. I can, so then you kind of consume food. And so their kind of theory is that we go through these periods of cognitive control where we kind of really have to think hard about things, and we invent things like computers and the internet. And then once we've got computers and the internet, it enables us to give up on thinking altogether because we just go like clicking on cats and fake news. And so, whether or not it's true, it's a really kind of intriguing theory, and it kind of made me wonder like where we are at the moment, where we live in relatively affluent societies. There's lots of stuff that we don't have to think about that's been taken off our plates. We seem to be responding more and more impulsively to, and politicians seem to be more and more happy to be led by their feelings, as do voters. So that kind of makes you wonder what's next in the cycle.
So, from the crisis of democracy to the invention of the refrigerator, the normal span you expect from an episode of Polarised. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks' time. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating or review in your podcast app. It really does help other people discover this programme. Polarised was presented by Ian Leslie and by me, Matthew Taylor. The producer was James Shield, and we were brought to you by the RSA with generous support from Thames and Hudson's Big Ideas series, which you can find now in bookshops. See you next time.